She looked at me in my son's kitchen, hands on the bodice of a wedding dress, and said the best wedding gift I could give them would be to disappear. The dress hung on a chair like a quiet accusation. Ivory lace pooled at Amanda's feet, and the sunlight from the back window caught the tiny beads and made them look like the sort of promises that never got kept. I felt the word go through me the way cold does when you step outside without your coat, sharp, immediate, and oddly clarifying. Disappear. As if I could be erased with a wish. I had sold my Victorian for $87,000 and handed it to them as a down payment. I had put another $37,000 into the house over the next few years. Small checks, big checks, wiring money from accounts Robert and I had saved for retirement and the grandchildren's education. I had insisted on granite countertops and fixed the heating when the kids complained in the first winter. I paid for the reception, $14,000 at Sunset Gardens, because that's what mothers did in my circle. You paid when you could, you hemmed your opinion about seating charts, and you smiled at the photos later. Disappear, Amanda said, as if I were a nuisance rather than a mother-in-law who had once pried wallpaper off plaster and sanded the stair rail with my bare hands because Robert loved the house, and I loved him for that. Some money once, she called it later, in a way that made all those evenings of patching leaks and driving to the flower market feel like petty transactions. That phrase, some money once, was not even accurate, and it was certainly not kind, but accuracy had nothing to do with the moment. What hurt more than the sentence was the dismissal that came with it. Not just the money, but the life I had poured into their home, and the belief that my contributions bought me a place at the table. I walked out of the kitchen. I didn't slam the door. I didn't throw the dress. I left quietly, because anger served no purpose in that bright, echoing house. I went home and I sat at my dining table, where Robert used to keep his compass and old receipts. I unfolded an envelope and began to find the paper trail. If you've ever been in the position of trying to prove your presence mattering, whether to a family, a community, or to yourself, you find that proof lives in the small things: canceled checks, wire transfer receipts, an email thread where someone said thank you and then never used the word again. I began with the big check, $87,000 front and center in my bank statements. I found the deposit slip, the notation on the seller's closing statement that matched the date. I started tallying the smaller ones, the repairs, the mortgage assistance, that added up to $37,000. I found the deposit for Sunset Gardens for $14,000, the confirmation number still printed on my email. The hurt had been immediate and naked, but my response was not. I called Margaret Chen, my lawyer of 20 years. Margaret is pragmatic, the kind of woman who organizes the books by color and then by date, and who refuses to use the word victim unless you've truly had wind knocked out of you and are still trying to breathe. She answered on the third ring. I'm not asking for sympathy, I said, because I knew if I began with the wound, I might begin to sob. I need to know what I own. She asked me to come by. She asked that I bring every document I had, and she told me in her calm way that the legal world prefers facts they can pin down with ink. That night, I sat on my living room floor, under a lamp that had belonged to Robert, and spread out the evidence like a court of small items: deeds and canceled checks, emails, receipts for china I had never used. I traced the arc of what I had done from the Victorian to the new house. The house they lived in now had been listed at just under $300,000 when they bought it. I had fronted the $87,000 as a down payment. That was a proper sum, a life's savings folded into a transaction meant to secure shelter and a future for my son and his partner. What had been offered to me in return, in the hours after Amanda's disappear line, felt like a betrayal that had smoothed itself into everyday life. You have to understand something. Generosity can be a slow erosion. It begins with roses on Valentine's Day and small loans for car repairs, It ends with entire savings accounts simply being recategorized as expected. You begin to believe the story you tell yourself, that giving makes you a better person, that being generous keeps your family safe, that your sacrifices are investments in love, and you stop naming the cost. I had been both generous and foolish. But there is a difference between foolishness and naivety, and even that difference can be reclaimed. I went to Margaret the next morning. She put the deed on the table between us, proper and stubborn as a stone. "You'll be glad you brought these," she said. She had already done the math while I stood there, trying to arrange my face into something neutral. The way the payment was structured, how the funds were transferred and recorded, plus the agreements you signed, means you hold 35% of the property. Those 3 words hit me with a different kind of shock. Not the emotional sort that leaves you trembling, but a practical, pivoting sort of shock. Leverage, ownership, not vengeance, a word I've always disliked, but an opportunity to insist on my dignity. I should be clear. I did not go to Margaret to concoct a punishment. I went because the kitchen line had been a tipping point. Whatever my motives, the law was now on the page, with numbers and names, and it confirmed what my gut had been whispering for months. This was not merely a family argument. It was an issue about respect and accountability, and it had a financial dimension that could no longer be ignored. "Can she ask you to leave?" I asked Margaret. Not because I feared eviction. Co-ownership complicates eviction in a way that is messy and expensive, but because I needed to know what my options were, beyond the emotional ones. "You have rights," she said. "We can present options. You can offer a buyout. You can propose a sale. You can set conditions if they want to buy you out. But we do this with documentation, not tweets." I nodded. Margaret's world preferred ink to emotion. That suited me in that moment. I was tired of shouting into the air. That same afternoon, I called Sunset Gardens. Jessica picked up. Sunset Gardens had a way of making everything sound soothing. Even their voicemail sounded like a promise. I told her to put a hold on the reception. There were complications. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't dial and declare war. I spoke plainly and gave her the booking number. Jessica asked if I was canceling altogether. I said, for now, yes. "Please confirm in writing," she asked. I did. When a $14,000 reception disappears from a calendar, it makes people uncomfortable in new ways. It is one thing to argue about who used whose fork. It is another to watch a plan dissolve that had already been sitting in the mouths of aunts and uncles. The reaction was immediate. Frantic calls, a few pleas about appearances, a thin attempt at shame. "You can't do this to my daughter's wedding," Amanda said in her second call to me, voice trembling with righteous offense, as if I'd broken some unspoken rule. Michael called me too, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes turning the phone over to Amanda so she could say things I already knew. But the line that had begun it all, disappear, remained central to my thinking. I noticed how often people who ask others to vanish do so as if their request is reasonable, as if the polite erasure of a person is a perfectly acceptable wedding favor. I realized then that my job would be to insist on being seen, even if that insistence made others look bad. I didn't say it on the phone. I never raised my voice. I asked questions. Where did they think they would be after the reception was canceled? Who would explain it to the guests? Did the caterer have non-refundable contracts? What would it do to the mortgage? Amanda and Michael had a habit of turning practical follow-ups into moral indictments. "You're making this about money," they said in chorus. I answered with facts. Facts are stubborn, they don't sound entitled. That night Michael showed up at my door. He had come alone, and there was something in his face I recognized from his childhood. The way he held his mouth steady when he was trying not to cry. I invited him in. He sat at the small kitchen table and rubbed his hands together. "Mom," he started, the word carrying all the weight of a son who wants to remember better days. "You tell me why you think I should disappear," I said. I wanted him to hear it said plainly. He swallowed. Amanda said she didn't want this. She said. He stopped. Sometimes men who are used to being protected by women in their lives don't know what to do when the woman in question refuses that role. Did you hear her? I asked. Did you hear what she asked? Yes, he said, and it... And what? I asked. It wasn't cruelty. It was curiosity. I wanted to know how he would frame the moment when his wife told his mother to vanish, that she'd prefer it, he said finally, that it would be easier. It's interesting, I said, because in my head, I remember years of dinners in this house where we laughed until we cried. I remember leaving spare blankets at the foot of little beds. I remember paying for an appliance you couldn't afford, but none of those moments put a sandwich under my name at this table last week. He looked at me then with something like guilt. I'm trying to keep peace, he said. I'm trying to make things smooth. That's not peace, I said. That's smoothing out a quilt until you can't tell which part belongs to whom. I wanted him to understand that erasure is not peace. We argued about softer things for a while, the seating chart that would now be meaningless, whether canceling the reception would cost them more in vendor fees than they realized. But the real argument came when he asked me quietly if I would reconsider. We can work this out, he said. We can make you part of it. I thought about the contract I had signed 8 years ago when I helped finance the down payment. It was not an extravagant legal instrument. It was a paper set of promises. But it had my name on it. It had my signature. It had numbers that made clear what equity I held. Michael's voice around me sounded small and earnest. He had not meant the word disappear, but he had aged into it because his marriage had demanded he pick a side. I'm not interested in choosing sides, I said. I'm interested in being treated like someone with rights. I'm interested in being treated like someone who matters. He left that night with his shoulders heavy, and I sat on my couch and opened the binder again. I began to plan. Not as retribution, not as spite, but as a means of setting boundaries that would protect what I'd left myself with. That is what boundaries do. They preserve the margins of your life so you can keep your heart intact. You would think that once you start reading contracts and adding numbers, the emotional fog would lift. It does. In the way a surgeon's blade clears away diseased tissue. It's uncomfortable and precise and necessary. My calculation was simple. If I had 35% ownership in a house valued at roughly $300,000, my share had a tangible figure attached to it. The math is not poetic. 35% of $300,000 is $105,000 on paper, though market value and mortgage complicate the real payout. That number made me feel steadier. It gave me terms to put in a voice, rather than a chorus of wounded feelings. But numbers were not the whole story. They could not buy back the quiet dinners I'd missed or the way Michael had once reached for my hand at a funeral without thinking about whether the audience approved. The patience of my life had been a currency I spent liberally, often without anyone acknowledging the exchange. Standing in Margaret's office, looking at the deed, I admitted to myself that the goal had changed. I no longer wanted only to be included in their life. I wanted to be respected within it. When I canceled the reception, the ripple hit more than just Amanda and Michael. Vendors called. Jessica at Sunset Gardens called to make sure I didn't need help with deposits or vendor contacts. I paid attention to the way the world rearranged itself when a party disappeared. Emails shifted. Chairs were suddenly free. People who had already committed to attend received a polite regret. For a family used to smoothing over problems, a canceled $14,000 reception felt momentous. It had the shape of a consequence they couldn't bluster away. That same week, I received a letter. A welfare check requested by someone. There is a strange procedural dignity to those checks. An officer shows up at your door not to accuse you, but to verify that the person named is indeed intact and alive. Detective Rodriguez came, polite and efficient, with his badge clipped to his belt and a pen in the pocket of his uniform. He asked me questions about my daily routines, about whether I managed my own finances, and about whether anyone had coerced me or isolated me. He looked at my filing system, the binder of documents I'd assembled, and he nodded in a way that suggested he understood the difference between dependency and ownership. "Everything seems in order," he told me. "You're clearly managing your affairs." You might think that police validation would feel like a vindication. It felt oddly calming. The detective's questions forced me to see that what had happened was not merely embarrassment. It was part of a pattern that could be tracked and documented. That pattern deserved a measured response. The weeks that followed were a series of small confrontations underpinned by paperwork. I had long conversations with Margaret about what words to use in letters, what tones neutral lawyers recommended. I practiced being factual instead of hurt. I learned to say, "We can resolve this by," rather than "you hurt me." Facts are not cold. They are a way to hold people to what they claim to value. When you set your terms with clarity, you give others a fair chance to choose differently. Amanda and Michael, squeezed by the sudden shift in electricity around their wedding plans, began to bargain. Bargaining is not apology, it is negotiation. Michael asked if I would accept a buyout. Amanda suggested I take a smaller amount and be done with it. I listened. I let them speak. I let them feel the pressure of consequences without adding theatrics. In private, I made a list of what I wanted. It was a strange task, to list what one wants from the adult children of a life. I wanted not only monetary fairness, but also terms that might prevent a repeat of that slipperiness, the sense that kindness could be pocketed and then spat out when inconvenient. I wanted them to demonstrate accountability in ways that mattered. Consistent repayment, transparent budgeting, perhaps a requirement that Amanda and Michael enroll in financial counseling. I wanted them to be honest about their spending. I wanted no more gaslighting. I knew that some would call me hard for asking for conditions. Love shouldn't have conditions, a neighbor told me when I mentioned the plan, as if love were a blank check. I told her that love also shouldn't be a cover for exploitation. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are its scaffolding. There were moments when shame tried to wedge its way back in. People my age are taught that family ties are to be preserved at almost any cost. We are advised to keep the peace, to swallow indignities in the name of togetherness. But I had spent a long life learning that peace that requires silence is a kind of slow violence. You can acquiesce until your bank account is empty and your voice is too small to be heard. I'd had enough of that. When I finally sat down to write the first letter, short, factual, and delivered by Margaret, I felt a strange, steady composure. The letter outlined the situation, the documented transfers, the ownership percentage, and the options to resolve the matter. It was a legal letter dressed in plain English. It offered choices but warned that leaving the issue unresolved would require more formal steps. I did not write it with malice. I wrote it because being erased had not been part of my bargain. That evening I watched Amanda scroll through the photos on her phone. Wedding dresses, tablescapes, filters that made everything look like it belonged in a magazine. She had once told me she loved my taste in flowers. I had chosen the peonies for her bouquet myself, driven to the market at dawn to get the best stems. I had listened to her interest in particular shades, and I had gone out of my way because those things made us laugh. People rarely remember the domestic labor behind a beautiful table because the labor is supposed to be invisible, like pulleys and drywall. But the beauty was there only because someone had done the work. To be invisible is to be taken for granted. I placed the letter in a stamped envelope and handed it to Margaret. I felt oddly light, not triumphant, not vindictive, simply present-minded and resolved. The next morning Margaret filed it. The family received notice. What I did not do was step into television lighting or theatrical rage. I did not shout or make a scene. Instead, I paid attention. I listened to the fallout, the calls from vendors who were willing to broker a catastrophic rescheduling, the whispered gossip down the block about the cancelled reception, the way relatives took sides in carefully measured ways. I took notes as if I were building a case for my own life, dates, times, words uttered in anger. Documentation is ugly to talk about because it sounds like betrayal, but it is also a way to prevent future erasure. Amanda left me a voicemail later that week where she sounded smaller and steadier than before. "I didn't mean it like that," she said. "I was stressed." I listened to the tape twice. People say things under stress that they would not say in a different moment. Intent matters, of course, but intent does not erase the consequences when someone uses your presence as a tool to smooth a social event. Michael came to my apartment one afternoon and stayed for tea. We did not talk about the letter at first. We spoke about Robert, how he would have made some wry remark about people who confuse convenience with love. We spoke about the garden and how the hydrangeas had bloomed that year in that stubborn blue that everyone loved. I felt the conversation settling into something human, and I allowed myself to enjoy it without suspending my boundaries. Yet underneath the polite talk, something was shifting. The family realized that my ownership stake was not an abstract notion. It had teeth. It made them reconsider options they had thought were simple. It made them look at their budget sheets and the numbers that had once been muffled under credit cards and excuses. I watched them prick at their own complacency. None of this happened because I wanted to punish them. It happened because I wanted to protect what remained of my life and to teach, by example, that dignity matters. There were nights I felt lonely. Setting boundaries can make people uncomfortable in ways that isolate you, but the loneliness was also an invitation. It made room in my apartment for new things. A second-hand armchair I bought because it fit my niece just right. A small table where I now write letters and keep my documents in neat piles. I began to notice the small freedoms of a life rearranged. I could choose to go to a lecture on Tuesday evenings without checking anyone's calendar. I could accept an invitation to dinner that was only for adults. I could say no and mean it. The pattern of escalation to that point had followed a logic I recognized from other fights. Hurt leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal becomes a crisis. Crisis prompts negotiations. But my response introduced a new variable, legal clarity. That clarity did not guarantee any particular outcome. It merely made clear the stakes and the responsibilities attached to them. One morning in the third week, a message arrived that pulled the scene back to the present tense. Amanda wanted to meet in a neutral place, the hotel lobby by the river, before the weekend. She said she wanted to talk. Michael feared the conversation would be public. I told them to meet where they felt comfortable. I am not a woman who stages confrontations. I prefer them quiet, factual, and witnessed. I have learned to value presence over performances. I drove to that hotel, hands steady on the wheel, and thought about how the story might go. Would there be apologies? Would there be bargaining about the numbers? Would they insist that the money was a gift all along? The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A woman at the desk gave me a look that suggested she had seen enough family drama to last a life. Amanda was there, hair tucked into a bun, wearing a sweater that made her look less like a bride than a woman trying not to be seen. Michael sat beside her, fingers crossed over each other. Amanda began by saying, "I said something I shouldn't have." It was a start. The words were not full reparation, but they were there. I took them in and counted them like small coins. Then she shifted and began to talk about how overwhelmed she felt, how the pressure of the wedding had been suffocating. I listened. But listening is not the same as conceding. We spoke about the house, about the money, about expectations. I spoke about the work I'd done, financially and otherwise, and I spoke about how the suggestion I vanish hurt. I did not cry. I had learned not to let my tears settle into pity. Amanda's face softened. She said she had been wrong to use that word. Michael shifted his weight. The conversation at the hotel did not settle everything, but it revealed something crucial. They were capable of acknowledging harm, even if awkwardly and in increments. That awareness would matter when Margaret began to put options on the table. I had not wanted to humiliate them. I had wanted to be recognized. The hotel talk nudged that recognition a smidge forward. On the drive home, I thought about Robert's voice in my head, the steady, wry commentary he carried with him. He would have laughed at the idea of a mother-in-law being asked to disappear. He would have said something cutting about people who assume generosity is eternal. I missed him fiercely. I miss him in the small moments when my instincts still reach for his counsel. But grief is a strange teacher. It helps you see what must be preserved and what must be let go. That night, I took out the deed again. I smoothed the paper and read the names. My name was there. So were theirs. The fact that my name was on that document was not a spiteful cudgel. It was a reminder that when you invest in someone's future, you deserve a place in it, or at the very least, transparency and a chance to be treated with decency. When the phone rang in the middle of the night, I knew who it would be. It was Amanda in tears, saying she was terrified of how the family would look if the reception remained cancelled, that relatives would blame her, that the wedding would be ruined. Her fear was real. The consequences of an abrupt change fall hardest on the person most visible. I tried to hold both realities at once, the injustice of being told to vanish, and the tangible fear that the cancellation would sting a bride. I spoke to her then, not as the woman who had every right to recoil, but as a person who once had hopes for a marriage that would include mutual respect. I am not trying to ruin your wedding, I told her. I'm trying to be treated fairly. We hung up with no tidy resolution, only a promise to keep talking. The promise felt fragile. That is the nature of promises. They can be both fragile and binding depending on what people are willing to do next. As dawn broke over the city, I made a decision that felt less dramatic than it was. I would not allow myself to be dismissed as if my life were a line item in someone else's budget. I would insist on being seen. I would insist on terms that reflected the truth of the sacrifice I had made. I would also leave the door open for change. I packed a small bag and went to Margaret's office with the deed and the hotel notes and a steady heart. Margaret looked at me when I sat down. "You know," she said, "you've done the sensible thing. You've documented, you've attempted conversation, and you've remained calm." "Am I being harsh?" I asked her, because I needed someone to say whether I'd crossed into something I might regret. "You're setting boundaries," she answered. "There's a difference. We spoke of possibilities, but she refused to give me a road map of revenge. She would not tell me how to humiliate or how to hurt. She told me instead what options were legally available in broad strokes and how they translated into my life in human terms. No specifics, just the outline. Buyout, sale, conditional agreements. We talked about how a conditional buyout could include terms like budget oversight, enrollment in counseling, and staged payments tied to behavior. We discussed how those terms would be enforceable without being cruel. I left Margaret's office with the folder she'd prepared, pages thick with options and implications. I felt the old exhilaration of having worked at something and not being reduced to helplessness. The power of a life is not the ability to punish. It is the ability to demand consistency between words and action. When I walked back into my apartment that evening, I saw the dress in my head again. I thought of the way Amanda had stood by the sink and said the word, disappear. I thought of the many small acts that had led to that moment and the many small acts that could lead away from it. I opened the folder and began to draft the next correspondence, the one that would lay out, not in anger but in terms, what I expected if we were to move past this indignity. There is a peculiar clarity that arrives when you accept that a relationship might change because of the boundaries you set. You can choose to be small in the face of hurt, or you can choose to stand and name the terms you need to stay whole. I chose the latter. I would not be erased. I would ask for justice as if it were a piece of furniture, plainly, without flourish, and expecting it to be carried through the door. I printed Margaret's folder twice and slid one copy into an envelope labeled "For Family." I walked the city block to the small mailbox outside the office and dropped it in. It felt oddly ceremonial, less like a war and more like setting a place at a table and sending the invitation ahead so people would know where to sit. Before the envelope even arrived, the family called. That was to be expected. When you begin to translate hurt into terms, people squirm. Words become bricks, and they want to rearrange the wall. Michael's voice was careful. Amanda's alternately contrite and defensive. Barbara Worth, Amanda's mother, called too. I had expected her to be firmly on her daughter's side. Instead, her tone surprised me. "Dorothy," she said, "we don't have to make enemies of one another." She sounded tired. "We'll talk." We met at Margaret's office 2 days later. Margaret sat with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that she did not touch, the way a surgeon resists fidgeting before the operation. The family filed into the small conference room like people taking seats before a show. Amanda's face was still raw. Michael's jaw had the tightness of someone who sleeps poorly. Barbara's hands were folded in her lap, as if she were bracing herself. Margaret explained the options without theatrics. She laid out, in plain language, what co-ownership meant and what it did not mean. She did not use the word punish. She spoke instead of fairness and enforceable commitments. I watched the family listen, and I watched Amanda's fingers drum against the arm of her chair. When Margaret mentioned the figure that represented my stake, her voice steady, the room inhaled in small, private ways. Numbers have a way of clarifying what feelings obfuscate. After Margaret spoke, I stood and put the terms on the table. I had not wanted to be transactional for its own sake, but I had learned that if you want behavior to change, you have to align incentives with expectations. The figure I proposed was not the full mathematical 35% of the house's listed value. I had never wanted to make their life impossible. I offered a discounted buyout, $75,000. It was generous in that it allowed them to keep the home, and it was firm in that it acknowledged years of assistance and regular payments that had been made. The buyout came with conditions. No theatrics, just things that would, in my mind, protect both the money and the relationships. Amanda and Michael would enroll in financial counseling for 1 year. Amanda would secure and maintain employment. They would agree to staged payments into an escrow account managed by Margaret's firm for the payout. Monthly basic budget statements would be shared with an appointed third party. There would be language in the agreement forbidding future attempts to mischaracterize the funds as purely gifts if evidence suggested otherwise. And there would be a clause that addressed behavior. If Amanda or Michael used the language intended to erase a family member, a portion of the buyout would be withheld and reallocated to restitution or community service. I framed the last item not as vengeance but as accountability. Words have effects, and consequences teach lessons better than sermons. None of this was meant to be punitive. I kept that in the center of my chest like a pebble, to remind myself that my purpose was repair, not retribution. I told them that my priority was dignity, mine and theirs, and that if they could not live within these terms, a sale of the property could be the next path. The idea of selling was not an idle threat. It was an option that preserves the value of all parties, but also dissolves the cozy narrative of entitlement. There was a silence after I finished speaking, as if a small animal had paused mid-scamper. Barbara was the first to respond. She surprised me again by saying, "We can do that. Amanda needs structure." Her voice was not triumphant, but weary, an acceptance that sometimes love must be scaffolded by rules. Amanda, for her part, looked at her hands. "I'll do the counseling," she said finally. "I'll get a job." The words were thin, but they were there. Michael's eyes found mine. "We don't want to lose you, Mom," he said, "and we don't want to drag this into court." He was speaking not just for himself, but for the version of the family that remembered shared birthday cakes and the way Robert could make anyone laugh by mispronouncing French words. That memory mattered. It always does. Margaret took notes, then said, "We'll draft a conditional buyout agreement for $75,000 with the provisions you've discussed. The terms will be enforceable and will include mediation as the first step if any disputes arise." I didn't ask her for the legalese. I only asked her to keep the language clear and humane. We signed a preliminary memorandum of intent that afternoon. Not a full settlement, but a promise to move towards specific actions. Amanda and Michael sat across from me and signed. There was no champagne. There was a quietness like an agreement between roommates to keep the apartment tidy, practical, adult, and necessary. I left feeling lighter, but the feeling was not simple. Setting boundaries always strips away illusions, even useful ones, and you may mourn what those illusions once provided. The aftermath was a fetching little storm. Vendors contacted Amanda and Michael about deposits. Some fees were non-refundable, others negotiable. Jessica at Sunset Gardens, bless her, worked to rebook parts of the reception and to find a solution that would allow a smaller celebration later. She called me once to apologize in the gentlest way for the chaos and to thank me for resolving things honestly. There was gossip, of course. Relatives who had chosen sides and friends who had felt compelled to offer advice. But the practical work of repair began to replace the theater of outrage. Within weeks, Amanda started working part-time at a local boutique. She was tentative at first, learning the rhythms of a spreadsheet and the small dignity of a pay stub that arrived on time. I watched from the edges, not intruding and not pretending the friction of those first months was not real. The counseling sessions were slow and sometimes painful. They revealed habits, spending to buffer anxiety, avoidance techniques to keep from having difficult conversations, and they revealed small victories too. Amanda learned to plan her clothing budget. Michael started answering direct questions about the mortgage rather than deflecting. People often ask whether these things can be enforced. Margaret set up an escrow arrangement that was straightforward in practical effect. Payments into the escrow would be conditional on milestones rather than contingent on private whims. I will not trumpet the legal structure, only the human result. Staged payments gave them a runway to meet both the financial obligation and the behavioral expectations. They did not like the oversight at first. I did not enjoy administering it, but the oversight created a pattern of accountability that allowed them to see themselves differently. I did what I think many of us fear. I made their growth contingent upon visible behavior. That is not the same as withholding love. It is asking for the right gestures of repair before trust is fully restored. Trust is not a switch. It is a series of lights that gradually turn from red to yellow to green as people demonstrate reliability. News of the arrangement trickled through family channels, and not everyone approved. A few cousins texted me a version of the old script. Family should stick together. Others sent quiet notes of support. One neighbor dropped off a lemon tart and a card that said, "Proud of you." Small gestures matter. They shore up the heart in ways that legal papers cannot. There were humiliations along the way. Amanda had to explain the situation at work once when a colleague asked about the canceled reception. She cried in the bathroom stall and then went back out and finished the afternoon. Michael had to look his children in the eye and say, "We'll have a smaller gathering." No mother loves to cause disappointment, but causing it in the short term can prevent long-term erosion. The children adjusted. Children are resilient when adults pull together in a consistent way. 6 months later, I had an invitation to a small, rescheduled celebration. No satin bows, no extravagant centerpieces, just a family meal with a few close friends. The air felt different. Amanda stood with a list and apologized to people quietly, not in the way of someone rehearsing lines, but in the way of someone who had been practicing being accountable. She hugged me in a moment that felt genuine. I did not melt into forgiveness as if all of it could be wiped clean with an embrace. Forgiveness is a process. It is not the same as forgetting. I accepted the apology as one step in that process. Meanwhile, my life filled in the quiet places I had cleared. I moved into a small apartment that had sunlight in the mornings and a community bulletin board that advertised yoga at the senior center and a book club that met on Thursdays. I bought the second-hand armchair because it fit my knees. I made friends with a woman named Helen who taught watercolor and an older man who baked bread on weekends. I learned the pleasures of a life that is ruled less by caretaking obligations and more by choices, like going to a lecture, taking a pottery class, or joining someone for coffee without checking whether the event would inconvenience others. And there was Frank. He was not a dramatic entrance. He was a neighbor I met over a malfunctioning elevator. He had a slow smile and a laugh that made room for other people. We discovered we both enjoyed a certain bland mid-century sitcom, and we began trading favorite lines. Frank is a marker of a life moving forward, not an antidote to what had happened. He did not fix what was broken. He simply enjoyed Saturdays with me in a way that did not require a contract. Amanda's progress was not linear. She missed a counseling session and then made an extra effort the next week. She forgot to send a budget statement one month and then sat with Margaret to learn an app that made the reporting easier. The payments into escrow were made, always on schedule, and in the months after the buyout began, she secured a full-time position with benefits. I watched the arc with a mixture of relief and quiet pride. It is strange to be proud of someone's practical steps, the way they pay a bill on time or fill out a form, but those small acts become the scaffolding of a dependable life. Michael, too, changed in small ways that mattered. He began opening mail at breakfast and discussing the mortgage over coffee. He stopped turning awkward conversations into jokes and started asking questions when he did not understand. Those small practicalities were not glamorous. They were deeply human. They made the basement of our shared life structurally sound again. Not everyone in our world approved of my choices. There were barbs and murmurs. Some relatives suggested I had been hard and that money should have been an unconditional gift. Others said I had been shrewd and sensible, praise that landed with an odd mix of satisfaction and discomfort. I had to live with the knowledge that kindness and firmness can look like cruelty depending on who is telling the story. That is a risk you take when you insist on being seen. The police welfare check, Detective Rodriguez's visit, turned out to be a protective moment more than anything else. A neighbor had called because rumors had suggested I'd been coerced, and the detective's visit allowed me to show my files and my capacities. He later told me in an offhand way that he was glad to see I kept meticulous records. It made the difference between an empty rumor and a documented pattern. That is perhaps the lesson of the ledger. It allows quiet authority to stand up and speak. One afternoon, months into the agreement's enforcement, Amanda came to my apartment with a small box of old letters she had found in her parents' attic. "I thought you should have these," she said. Inside were postcards from a travel back before children, a few pressed flowers, and a note Robert had written to me when we were young and worrying about money. She turned and looked at me. "I know you did all of this for us," she said. "I know I said a terrible thing. I am sorry." I accepted the apology. I told her the truth, that I had been hurt and that her apology was a beginning. She cried, and this time my reaction was not a collapse, but a quietness. I reached across the table and touched her forearm. "Show me," I said. "Show me in your life." Action over words. The simplest test. They continued with the payments, the counseling, the monthly budgets. The staged buyout reached its end point, and the final funds were transferred into my account under conditions that included a small academic scholarship for one of my grandchildren, an idea Amanda proposed, so she could tangibly redirect something of the past into the future. She wanted to do something restorative. I accepted the offer. It felt right. It was not an erasure, but a reweaving. There came a moment when I realized that I no longer measured my days by worry about whether someone would ask me to vanish. That fear had been a great dull ache in my chest, and its absence surprised me with relief. In its place grew a steadiness. I kept friends, a quiet routine, and the sense that I had been brave in a way that was not loud. I had kept my dignity, and in doing so, I had taught my family something about boundaries and safety. The relationship with Amanda became something quieter and more human, sometimes affectionate, sometimes distant. We were not back to the easy, unguarded laughter of earlier years, but we were learning a new currency, reliability. She came to Thanksgiving and did not attempt to dominate the preparation. She arrived with a pie she had actually baked, not something bought at the last minute. Those small choices, maybe more than the papers or the payments, told me she had learned. I want to be clear about the cost. It was real. Setting boundaries cost me the version of family I had imagined when I gave the money. I lost a little of the narrative that said we all flourished together without friction. But I gained a life where my voice mattered and where my contributions were visible, not assumed away. The trade-off was not aesthetic, it was necessary. There were also consequences I had not foreseen. A neighbor I had known for years stopped speaking to me for a season, disgusted that there could be legal writing between mothers and daughters-in-law. Another cousin came and wept with gratitude, saying, "Thank you for showing me I can be honest without losing everything." People are complicated in how they respond to justice. That complexity is part of the landscape you must learn to navigate when you choose boundaries over peace at any cost. As winter thawed into spring, Amanda invited me to a small brunch, not wedding scale, not ostentatious, just an acknowledgement. She read a short note to the family, a careful public apology practiced not for theatrics, but for truth. Michael, standing beside her, said thank you, not in a way that erased past wrongs, but in a manner that accepted accountability. They had not become perfect. They had merely learned how to be less damaging. I met Frank officially at that brunch when he arrived with a small bouquet of something cheerful. He smiled, offered me a seat, and somehow, in his ordinary presence, made the world feel steady. He did not fix my past, nor did he attempt to. He sat beside me and listened to a story about Robert and laughed in the appropriate places. Our courtship was the sort you read about in pleasant memoirs. A potluck here, a walk there, a shared cup of tea in the post office line. It was gentle and kind, and had no need to prove anything. If you ask what I learned, I would say this: boundaries can be an act of radical love. That phrasing might startle some people who think boundaries are cold or selfish. They are neither. Boundaries are, at their best, a way to love yourself so that you can love others without dissolving into a puddle of resentment. They show people what you expect from them because you expect to continue sharing life, not because you assume the costs will disappear. I tell this story not to boast, but to offer a companionable hand to anyone who has experienced being used or erased. The ledger is a blunt instrument, but it is also a tool for speaking truth. Documents do not feel things, and they cannot hold memories the way people do, but they do translate the invisible labor of a life into something visible. When someone reduces your history to some money once, you have the right to insist that your life is more than a line item. Do not misunderstand me. There is no simple fairy tale ending where all wounds vanish and everyone sits by a happy hearth forevermore. Amanda still apologizes when she stumbles, and I still grit my teeth sometimes when old habits rise. We continue to work on the lines we need to draw, the ways we need to speak, and the habits we must reform. But we are, on the whole, moving in a healthier direction. The final lesson landed in a small, ordinary way. A neighbor's car broke down on a rainy Wednesday. I saw her struggle with a flat and set down my bag and helped change the tire. She pressed a folded dollar into my hand and called me a saint. I laughed and said I wasn't. I was simply a woman who had learned that sometimes you must step back in order to step forward. You refuse to be erased, not out of spite, but out of care for the life you still have to give. One evening, as the sun slid between buildings and painted the room with gold, I walked through Margaret's file one last time and closed the binder. The pages had held the trajectory of a difficult few months. They were not trophies, they were records of a preserved life. I tucked a small photograph of Robert into the front of the binder, a reminder of the life we built and the values we tried to preserve. I think he would have approved of my steadiness. Amanda, no longer the girl who asked me to vanish, but an adult who has made real missteps and real amends, texted me a short note the next day. "Thank you for not walking away," she wrote. The message was small. It was enough. If you are watching this because you wonder whether you should set a boundary, know this. You are not being unloving for asking to be treated with decency. You are not a villain for asking for fairness. Love is not a free pass for exploitation. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you love is to refuse to be their ATM. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do for yourself is to demand to be seen. If this story has touched you, like and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I read them and your stories matter to me. And if you did what I did, or if you were the one who needed to hear, "I will not be erased," tell me what happened. Share your story below. Have you ever had to choose between peace and your dignity? How did you decide? We learn from one another. I didn't go into those months thinking I would emerge unscathed. I only knew I would not disappear on someone else's timetable. That choice, awkward, costly, necessary, gave me back the life I wanted to keep. Sometimes love looks like quiet firmness, sometimes like a forgiveness that grows slowly, and sometimes like moving into a second-hand armchair that fits your knees. For me, it looked like all of those things. I am older, steadier, and no less generous. But I am no longer invisible. And for that, not for the money, but for the dignity, I am quietly grateful.